Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. To get things started, over to Sean.
A great day, comrades. We sail into history.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, that's all you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, well, title gives it away. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love, just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try not to do snark. I try not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation of just how hard it is to get a film off the ground. Enough preamble then. I'm going to move us all the way back to 1990 for the first of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. Let me play you a clip from the trailer and I'll come to the story, the other side of this.
The most brilliant commander in the Soviet Navy.
Ramey has trained most of their officer corps. He's nearly a legend in the submarine community.
The most deadly submarine ever built.
This thing could park a couple of hundred warheads off Washington. Nobody'd know a thing about it until it was all over.
And once more, we play our dangerous game with our old adversaries, the American Navy.
His plan is a mystery.
A man with your responsibilities reading about the end of the world.
Apparently, he has suffered a kind of nervous breakdown in which he announced his intention to fire his missiles on the United States.
We want us to help you hunt him down, kill him.
Open the outer doors, firing point procedures.
We sail into history.
I'm gonna blow him right to Mars.
Ramius might be trying to defect.
You're just an analyst. What can you possibly know what goes on in this mind?
I'll give you 3 days to prove your theory correct.
I am not field personnel. I am only an analyst.
You're perfect.
I'm expendable.
And that was a clip from 1990's The Hunt for Red October, directed by John McTiernan, screenplay by Larry Ferguson and Donald E. Stewart, based on the Tom Clancy novel of the same name. Sean Connery took the lead alongside Alec Baldwin, Scott Glenn, James Earl Jones and Sam Neill. And, well, the story of The Hunt for Red October also brought to the screen for the first time the character of Jack Ryan, a enduring character on screen big and small. Most notably at the moment, John Krasinski is playing him on the small screen, but of course there have been a selection of films starring Harrison Ford, Ben Affleck and in this case Alec Baldwin as Ryan. And so the story begins here, inevitably, with the book by Tom Clancy that became a bestseller in 1984. But even by the time the book had been published, galleys of the book had been doing the rounds in Hollywood. Would people be interested in bringing it to the screen? Well, yes, they would. And in this case, it was a producer called Mace Neufeld, a man who we recently lost. And he fairly quickly actually acquired the rights to the book. So that, in theory, should make this a relatively small film story and we can all go home early. However, the problem was, even though he had the rights to the book and even though the book very quickly became a bestseller, what he didn't have was a Hollywood studio willing to pony up the cash to make a Hunt for Red October movie. I mean, he certainly offered it around town. MGM United Artists had a good look, for instance, and said no. And, I mean, with the exception of independent studio Orion Pictures, pretty much everyone passed on him. In fact, the problem with Orion Pictures as well is, whilst it was keen to do the film, the offer that it put forward, well, it just wasn't enough, really. And Neufeld stuck to his guns, wasn't happy with said offer, turned it down. And in the end, it would take 5 years before he would finally get the movie made. And as he told the Lawrence Journal World in a syndicated interview around the time of the film's release, he explained that the book itself doesn't condense well into 2 or 3 pages. And the problem was, when he went to pitch the book, well, movie studios liked things that condensed well, that they could very quickly sell. And in this case, it's the story of a Russian submarine captain going rogue, and it gets a lot more labyrinthine than that. And how do you even put that on a poster? How do you sell it to people? And Hollywood studios just decided, well, no, it's not very high concept, which was the big thing in blockbuster cinema in the late 80s and early 90s. And so that's why people kept passing. But what happened was, in the end, when the novel became such a hit, I mean, MGM United Artists got back in touch, and a deal in the end was fairly quickly struck, but not with that studio. Instead, Neufeld had got the boss of Paramount Pictures to read the book, and he was quickly sold on it, wanted a deal done. It took a bit of pressing to get said executive to read the text in the first place, but once they did, they were just like, okay, I kind of see something here. And so Neufeld employed Donald E. Stewart and Larry Ferguson to pen the script, with the stipulation being that it had to meet with the approval of Tom Clancy. Now, Tom Clancy could be a bit of a stickler. If you listen to his commentary track for the film The Sum of All Fears, directed by Phil Alden Robinson, he opens up with the line, "I'm the guy who wrote the book they ignored." And Phil Alden Robinson, in the episode I recorded with him for The Sum of All Fears, does address the fact that Tom Clancy could be a tough customer. Now, this is something that many who adapted his books would soon find out, but Clancy did work on the script here. It was his first experience with Hollywood. And so, even though the studio wasn't initially convinced by the scripts that they were coming through, the prolonged process of writing just continued. And by the time the film made it to production, it was over 20 different drafts of the screenplay had been put together before Paramount was happy enough to press the green light on the movie. Now, the script in the end, and this is not true of all Tom Clancy adaptations, would be quite loyal to the text, and it would be Ferguson and Stewart who are ultimately credited with the final draft of the screenplay. That final draft of the script was submitted in the middle of 1988, so already we're a few years down the line on this particular story. And in the midst of writing, there was the small matter of a writer's strike from the Writers Guild of America. I mean, that slowed down development. And there was also a bit of a battle over another Jack Ryan book, Patriot Games. And the rights to that were going a bit backwards and forwards, because Patriot Games had been published in 1987. This would also bring back the character of Jack Ryan. And the deal that Neufeld didn't give him instantly the rights to that book. And so the TV rights to Patriot Games had been sold elsewhere. And so a television adaptation of that was in the works, courtesy of the American television network ABC. Now, ABC had got the rights from the first publisher of the book, but not the second. And so this caused confusion and concern for Paramount Pictures. It wanted to be first to the screen. Also, did it want Jack Ryan to be seen as a small screen character? This wasn't really the era where television and movies met. There was still an element of church and state about television and film. And there were genuine questions in the Paramount boardroom about, would people go to a Jack Ryan movie if the character was active on television? Now, in the end, ABC didn't get all the rights that it needed. It certainly got some of them in the first instance, but it didn't get the full release that it required to be able to make its television series. Paramount insisted that it had first dibs. There was confusion that there was more than one publisher of the book involved. But in the end, ABC decided to back out of the project with the sniff of legal problems ahead, presumably not helping for the network. And over time, Paramount would swoop in and get the Patriot Game rights too, as well as ongoing Jack Ryan projects, including Clear and Present Danger and The Sum of All Fears. So, in the midst of all this, back to the Hunt for Red October, which was being developed even as a little battle over Patriot Games was going on. And by the summer of 1988, the studio was confident enough to start looking for directors, and also wondering how on earth do you bring a film to the screen that really needed the cooperation of the Navy and Navy vessels in order to be realised. Now, John McTiernan was a man who'd been working on this film called Die Hard. You heard of that? He was sounded out as a director, and he was certainly interested. And the Navy separately was approached about getting access to its submarines for the film. Now, this was the era where Top Gun had just been a massive smash. A Paramount picture as well, that certainly helped. And the aftermath, the long tail of Top Gun was it proved to be a very potent recruitment advert for the American Armed Services. And in the end, there was a feeling, in spite of the subject matter of The Hunt for Red October, that if it was a hit movie, it could have a similar effect. And so the Navy was consulted and agreed to get involved. And inevitably, there were some script suggestions involved and a little bit of toing and froing there. But in the end, access was given. And so they had official Navy cooperation. John McTiernan, he was on board. There was a script ready. And so it was a case of who we're going to get to play this character of Jack Ryan and who we're going to get to play Russian submarine captain Ramius. So the role of Ryan, the choice was logical for Mace Neufeld, Kevin Costner, and he was quickly sounded out about taking the part on. But it was a case of circumstances just working against Costner, who would ultimately appear in a supporting role in Kenneth Branagh's Jack Ryan Shadow Recruit many films down the line. But at this stage, at the point that he was being sounded out about playing Jack Ryan, he was embroiled in this film called Dances with Wolves that Hollywood was sneering at him for choosing to make. But he opted to go with Dances with Wolves. It would transform his career, as I've discussed in a previous podcast, and that left the Ryan role open. Now, it was in December 1988 that Alec Baldwin revealed to the American press that he first became aware of the picture and that he was being sounded out for it. Now, at the end of 1988, Alec Baldwin was seen as a quality supporting actor in movies. We'd seen him in the likes of Working Girl, in Married to the Mob, that's a really good film there, in Beetlejuice, but a lead role, well, he wasn't really being offered that. And when The Hunt for Red October first passed his desk, he didn't think he was up for the lead role of that either. However, in this instance, he was. He was offered and took the part of Jack Ryan, and alongside him, in came a stellar cast: Scott Glenn, James Earl Jones, Sam Neill, Tim Curry, Courtney B. Vance, and for that crucial role of Captain Marco Ramius, well, an Austrian actor called Klaus Maria Brandauer, he took it on. And so there we had it. The cast was in place. The cast and crew, in fact, were given a tour of Navy submarines before filming as well. The preparation work could be done. The pre-production was underway. Jan de Bont, who's talked about the film on a previous episode of the Film Stories podcast, he was hired as director of photography. He was 4 years away from making his directorial debut with Speed at this point. But the film was coming together, and in early April 1989, with around a $30 million budget, filming could get underway. However, it did not take long at all for problems to hit on the production, primarily that it lost one of its two leads, because filming had been underway for a good week or two when Klaus Maria Brandauer relayed news back that he couldn't report to the set after all. He had another commitment he had to honour, and he just couldn't get out of it. Well, where did this leave The Hunt for Red October? The answer to that was in deep trouble. The film was up and running. It was not on the cheap side either. It was pushing towards a release date as well. And so plan A was out the window, and a plan B was desperately required. They needed someone with gravitas to take on the co-lead role in what was, after all, a blockbuster movie. And so the script was sent out with an SOS attached to Sean Connery. And Connery took a look at it. It was faxed to him. I love the idea that 100-odd pages of this was sent over a ropey old fax machine. But it was. Connery read it, and what he admitted, I wasn't sold on it. Because, as he pointed out, I thought this kind of Cold War intrigue might be dated. And the thing is, Connery had a point. This was the era of Mikhail Gorbachev coming to head up the USSR as it was then, and the thawing of the Cold War, the Hunt for Red October. He's set slap bang in the middle of it, between tensions between the United States and Russia that at that point in actual history were cooling, that the world seemed, just for a small glimmer of time, a much safer and nicer place. For Sean Connery and Paramount Pictures trying to sell a movie about the Cold War just as it seemed to be coming to an end, well, there was a big question mark over that. However, it turns out the fax that Sean Connery was sent it just had a page missing at the start, wouldn't you know it? And so that page, as Connery would explain, it just said, I thought this kind of Cold War intrigue might be dated, and it turned out the studio had failed to fax the first page of the script, which explained it took place before the era of Mikhail Gorbachev in Russia. And so Connery, in the end, he fairly quickly agreed to take the role on, but with the condition that an extra day, well, a day of rehearsal really, would be built in so that he could capture the part, the character, the approach towards playing a Russian submarine captain, which, as it turned out, was to use his regular accent. He arrived for Los Angeles in filming on a Friday. He was shooting by the Tuesday, including that rehearsal day that presumably took place on the Monday. In the midst of it all as well, John Milius was brought in to do some uncredited rewrite work on the screenplay. But then there was the physicality of making a submarine movie. And so Jan de Bont would talk about how he was cramped into just like the smallest of spaces, places where he would be operating the camera and there'd be barely any room for anyone else, just in the part of the set that he was required to shoot a sequence. The submarine sets themselves, they were adding stresses, that they had two 50-foot square platforms constructed to hold the two main craft of the film, the Red October and the USS Dallas. Now, going spoiler light, there I won't go into detail about the importance of both of those vessels, short of to say they are both very big, they are both in the film a lot, and for the purposes of shooting, they were both mounted onto hydraulic gimbals, which meant that on a soundstage in Hollywood, the movements of the submarines themselves could thus be simulated. Subsequent submarine films such as Crimson Tide would go on to use a similar technique, using these gimbals that would just rock the vessels left, right and centre. And the actors in the midst of all of this, well, it wasn't just Jan de Bont, but the actors were on the set and also they were cramped in there too. In the words of Sean Connery, for instance, he talked about how there were 62 people being in a very confined space, 45 feet above the stage floor. He described how the sets were hot, that they were tilting up to 45 degrees too, and it just wasn't an easy shoot. A lot of it taking place on sound stages, all of it shot within the US, and the extensive production of it ended after 3.5 months, on the 20th of July 1989, having had to replace one of its leading men just weeks into filming. Now, as the film headed into post-production, Paramount had given itself a little bit of wiggle room in terms of when to release the movie, that it had earmarked March of 1990 for it. And so that gave McTiernan time in post-production, and it also gave Paramount a chance to solve the problem of how to release this film, given the state of global geopolitics at the point. The whole idea that the Cold War had seemingly melted away, and the news cycle was in a very, very different place to the film that Paramount Pictures was trying to sell. Now, it was talking to Entertainment Weekly that Mace Neufeld just explained how he saw it all a little bit different, because he thought the Cold War aspect never really represented a major problem. And he said, from the beginning, we were determined not to turn it into a Russia-bashing movie. It's about a man defecting, one government that's trying to stop him, and our government which is trying to help him. And in Neufeld's eyes, it's a fairly simple story. Now, saying that, he had optioned it when communism was very much alive and well in Russia in the early 1980s, but that subsequent period of six odd years while he was trying to get it made, things had changed a lot, and he just decided, well, we're just going to sidestep it, really. And John McTiernan too, he argued this was more a sea story than anything else. And so when it came to putting the poster together, well, the poster was designed by a man called Tony Seiniger, and it studiously avoided mention of a Soviet threat there and decided to lean into kind of the techno-suspense side of the story, and also heavily on its leading actor, Sean Connery, who at this stage was enjoying a really successful period of his career. He'd just won his Academy Award. The summer before, he'd been in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade and had proved a huge audience-pleasing performance in that film. His box office was doing well, he was getting acclaim, and it made sense to lean on Connery to the point of, if you look at the poster, you almost forget that Alec Baldwin is even in it, that Baldwin had secured his first leading role, and then when it came to the publicity for it, well, his name is under the title, and his picture is nowhere to be seen on the poster itself. That said, Paramount was insistent it wasn't trying to play down the idea of the Cold War origin of the story, but as a rival studio marketing executive was quoted as saying in Entertainment Weekly piece, they're very nervous about it. The world has changed. Gorbachev at this point was Times Man of the Decade, and defection is no longer an issue. The film then went into cinemas in March of 1990, and the reception to it, well, it was really strong. That the reviews were, praising the fact that it was quite an old-fashioned thriller at heart, but also a very, very well-made and claustrophobic one, and the performances came out well too. That once you'd work past the fact that Sean Connery didn't even attempt a Russian accent in the role of Ramius, well, it was a proper movie star performance in the film. It's worth noting that Harrison Ford would go on to do a submarine film where he would take on a Russian accent in K-19, The Widowmaker, many years later. That didn't fare as well. Alec Baldwin too, his portrayal came in for praise, and also the fact that it was just a very well cast film, that even though the characters might sometimes flutter between 2 and 3 dimensions, that there was a strong enough ensemble to bring them all to life, that it was marked down as a very positive and very well made Hollywood thriller. Would audiences turn up though? Yeah, they did. On the opening weekend of March the 2nd to the 4th, 1990, roaring into first place by some distance was The Hunt for Red October, grossing $17 million on just over 1,000 screens in the US. It dethroned Driving Miss Daisy in the midst of its Oscar run at that point on its 12th week of release and had topped the chart the week before. The only new release in the top 16 as it happened was a small film called Too Beautiful for You, which was in 16th place. But the chart at this point was primarily full of either Oscar fare or action movies. So you had things like Steven Seagal in Hard to Kill, that was in 3rd place. Born on the 4th of July was sat in 5th. Tom Cruise was having an Oscar run for that. Cinema Paradiso was bubbling around, Roger and Me as well. Back to the Future Part 2 down in 13th place on its 15th week of release. But it was, The Hunt for Red October was just very number one, and it would hold off the competition the following week as well. There's quite a lot of competition too. The Handmaid's Tale opened in 12th. Bad Influence opened in 4th. House Party opened in 3rd. Joe versus the Volcano with Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan in 2nd. Hunt for Red October held virtually all of its business, only dropping 18% on its second weekend. And the word of mouth was powering it on, even as films like Blue Steel opened the week after that. Blue Steel's a really good film, as is Blind Fury that also opened, but Blind Fury opened in 12th place. That is shameful, American audiences of 1990. In the end, it was Pretty Woman that knocked The Hunt for Red October off the top of the chart, but that didn't happen until the end of March. And by that stage, it was on to be one of the hits of the season. Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles wasn't far behind. But by the time The Hunt for Red October left US cinemas, it had $122 million in the bank. Outside of the US, it did, about another $80 million. So for Paramount's $30 million investment, there was $200 million of box office and a sizable video hit as well. And some interest from the Academy Awards. 3 Oscar nominations it picked up for film editing, sound and best sound effects editing. It won for sound effects editing. And this was a success, without question, a success. It had worked that even though Connery, for instance, had come in at the last minute, and now it's hard to think of anyone else playing that particular role. And Paramount very quickly decided it wanted more Jack Ryan films. If you've got one hit, let's try and get another. And so the road was paved towards making Patriot Games. But that, as I've covered on a very, very early episode of the Film Stories podcast, was a very different proposition, that Tom Clancy was a lot more alive to the ins and outs of Hollywood at that point. And as much as Alec Baldwin was assumed to be the incumbent Jack Ryan, by the time Patriot Games made it to the screen in the summer of 1992, he was nowhere to be seen. And there continues to be conflicting accounts as to just why Alec Baldwin was defenestrated from his Jack Ryan throne. Baldwin, he believed he was the incumbent, but Harrison Ford's availability, by the sounds of it, turned the heads of Paramount Pictures, although Paramount has a different view on it. Lots of different viewpoints are out there waiting to be discovered. The bottom line was that as much as The Hunt for Red October kick-started the Jack Ryan screen franchise, most of the key creatives that you saw involved in that first film just weren't involved going forward. We didn't see Sean Connery again. We didn't see Alec Baldwin again. We did see James Earl Jones. Didn't see John McTiernan. The Hunt for Red October feels like a bit of a one-off. There really isn't much in the way of connected tissue to where the Jack Ryan saga went on the screen next. And so, there we have it, a 1990 standalone thriller, effectively. As much as it's part of the box set, it is very much its own thing, and a further contributory piece of evidence to the whole idea that it's really hard to make a bad submarine film. And that brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. I got this far without trying to do a Sean Connery impression. I'm certainly not going to try and do one now. Couple of parish notices then that if you like this podcast, three things really. Number one, if you really like it and want to put some funds towards the research of it, towards the Film Stories project, if you head over to patreon.com/Simon Brew, you get the podcast early pretty much every week. You certainly get it ad free as well. You find out the gossip of what we're up to behind the scenes. You get early notice of upcoming episodes and interviews as well. That's patreon.com/Simon Brew. Costing you absolutely nothing. Well, if you can subscribe to this podcast at your podcast home of choice, that helps me enormously. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, all of these things are just big contributors to this podcast getting this far. We're at episode nearly 310-ish at the point this has been recorded. I've got live shows coming up as well. The week this podcast goes out, I'm in London at King's Place on the 20th of April 2023. Then I'm heading to Stockport on May the 3rd. I'm back in Birmingham, what looks like May the 24th. You can find details of all upcoming Film Stories live events at filmstories.co.uk. If you tap the live events tab at the top there, you can get all the ticket details. Look forward to hopefully seeing quite a few of you there. Got some really good guests lined up as well. And then we publish Film Stories magazine, of which issue 42 is on sale now. This leads on the British action film Polite Society. Very, very proud to put that on our front cover. There's 100 pages full of film writing there. You can find that and all of our magazines at store.filmstories.co.uk. But that is enough parish notices. I'm going to zip us all the way forward to 2021 now for the second of the two films I'm talking about in this episode of Film Stories. Bit of a monster mash this. Let me play you a clip from the trailer. Come to the story, the other side of this.
This is our only chance. We have to take it. We need Kong. The world needs him to stop what's coming. And this child, she's the only one he'll communicate with.
I knew that they had a bond. She had nowhere to go, so I made a promise to protect her. And I think that in some way, Kong did the same.
And that's a clip from 2021's Godzilla Vs Kong, directed by Adam Wingard. Screenplay credited in the end to Eric Pearson and Max Borenstein, based on a story by Terry Rossio and Michael Doherty and Zach Shields. Starring Alexander Skarsgård, Millie Bobby Brown, Rebecca Hall, Brian Tyree Henry, Shun Oguri, Elsa Gonzalez, Julian Dennison, Lance Reddick, Carl Chandler and Demian Bashir. And when cinema needed a hero to reboot the box office in 2021, it ended up with two of them, a long-awaited mashup of two of Hollywood's biggest ever monsters, even though one of them didn't actually start in Hollywood. But inevitably, there was a story underneath all of this. So we're at Godzilla vs Kong, and come the early 2010s, Legendary Entertainment, headed up by Thomas Tull, was a major name in Hollywood. It had been financing and co-producing deals with primarily Warner Brothers. And in fact, back in 2005, it announced a deal to co-produce and co-finance movies with the Warner Brothers studio that ended up with about 40 movies being done. And one of the last projects to slide under the deal of that, as Legendary decided to really get up sticks and move elsewhere, was the Gareth Edwards directed big screen reboot of Godzilla, the Hollywood version of Godzilla that came out in 2014. Now, it came out just as Legendary had inked a similar 5-year deal with Universal instead of Warner Brothers, so it was moving home, but the Godzilla project was still with Warner Brothers. Now, one of the first projects that Legendary was working upon with Universal was also a big screen revival for King Kong, who'd been off the big screen since Peter Jackson's mid-2000s, highly expensive, very long and really quite engaging take on the character. That was set up at Universal, but Kong Skull Island, as the new film was ultimately going to be called, would be directed by Jordan Vogt Roberts, and it was part of a plan for, what wouldn't you know it, a big monster cinematic universe, because this was, as it is now, the era of the cinematic universe. And if you could get three movies together and connect them in some way, a universe you duly had. Now, it made some sense in the scheme of the various big monster properties doing the rounds that you could glue them all together. And so that was really the inkling of a plan that was coming to the fore. Because at the time, the film was just known as Skull Island, and it had been put together at Universal. But in September 2015, so a year after Legendary and Universal had started their deal, with it known that a planned crossover universe was being planned, came the news that Legendary, surprisingly, had actually moved the Skull Island project away from Universal and back to Warner Brothers. Now, Warner Brothers was off developing other projects of its own, and it was said that there were some in the studio who were particularly sad to see the back of Legendary, but Legendary was now back on the Warner Brothers lot with a project. Jordan Vogt Roberts came in to direct the movie Kong Skull Island that would be. Now, as Deadline noted, what this also cleared up with the Skull Island project moving to Warner Brothers was the possibility of a much-rumoured King Kong and Godzilla mashup. So, the Kong Skull Island project, and I'll come to it in a separate podcast at some point, was dated for March of 2017 by this point. It had a cast in place, including the likes of Brie Larson and Tom Hiddleston, and the deal to switch studios for the project was also cleared with Toho, the Godzilla rights holders back in Japan, so that a mashup movie could happen, and things were now starting to move. Now, a week after the studio shift happened, The Hollywood Reporter ran a piece digging deep and alleging some unhappiness between Thomas Tull of Legendary and Universal Pictures. Now, it didn't help that the early 2014 movies under the new deal hadn't really fared well at all. As Above, So Below didn't do great. Dracula Untold, that didn't do great. Seventh Son, Unbroken. I mean, these weren't films that were setting the box office alight. Legendary put money into Jurassic World, meanwhile, but trade reporting opened up rumours of unrest over who took what amount of credit. In fact, as the Hollywood Reporter piece noted, Tull bought potentially hundreds of millions of dollars in film financing to Universal after his relationship with Warner soured, and this is quoting, amid similar reports of tension over that studio's perception that he grabbed credit for Christopher Nolan's Batman movies and other hits on which he was a financing partner. And the implication seemed to be that Legendary was doing the same again on Jurassic World, when apparently, and someone from Legendary with expensive lawyers, feel free to refute me, was primarily putting finance in rather than creative direction. Now, Universal, as the Hollywood Reporter noted, did actually have the option to make a Kong movie, but the $125 million price tag that would take put the studio off. That Legendary was delivering a run of projects that just weren't hitting, and a 9-figure investment in a big monster movie where the returns weren't entirely clear, well, it was just a deal too far. So Warner Brothers moved quickly here, not just agreeing to take on the Kong Skull Island project, but also inking a 3-picture deal, one that added a further Godzilla film to the mix, as well as the Godzilla and Kong crossover, that the path was now cleared for this particular project to move forward. The deal was that Warner Brothers on Kong Skull Island was to pay 25% of the budgets on that, and also Godzilla, and on the eventual Godzilla vs Kong, but it would also stump up for all of the marketing costs. Legendary would pay the rest of the budget. Now, in the end, Kong Skull Island, I've talked about that more than the film we're here to talk about thus far in this particular story, would prove a solid success for Warner Brothers, and it openly seeded future films. I mean, it was not shy, if you went through the post-credits of that particular film, of setting up what was going to come. And basically, the monster universe was in business. Work was underway fairly quickly on what would become Godzilla King of the Monsters, which arrived in cinemas in 2019 from director Michael Dougherty. Dougherty had made the brilliant Trick or Treat, But in the case of King of the Monsters, well, things didn't work quite as well. That the reviews were not kind for that particular film. But the movie did still make the kind of cash that didn't quite discourage a further adventure and a further entry in the box set. And it was a good job because the project that would become Godzilla vs Kong was already underway at that stage. That Legendary was getting the screenplay and the story working on it, and also it was leaning into what's become quite a controversial approach to breaking stories and coming up with screenplays and stories for movies, in that it was deploying the writer's room approach, that fairly common in television, but it's becoming increasingly frowned upon in films. And we've seen this used by the likes of Paramount with the Transformers films, that it put together a writer's room of potential scribes who bashed together all sorts of ideas, and then they picked the films they were looking to make. And that was where Legendary was going with a Godzilla vs Kong project as well. And as the Hollywood Reporter noted, Terry Rossio, who co-written the Pirates of the Caribbean films, was leading the room. And joining him, well, there was the writing duo Patrick McKay and J.D. Payne, who'd co-written Star Trek Beyond. At that stage, we're working on a further Star Trek film, which hasn't yet appeared. Lindsay Beer, she was hired. Kat Vasco, who was working on an adaptation of the story Queen of the Air. We've not seen that either. T.S. Nolan, who'd penned the Maze Runner films, was also working on Pacific Rim 2 at that stage. Jack Paglin, who'd penned Transcendence, starring Johnny Depp. They'd done a bit of work on Alien Covenant as well. And J. Michael Straczynski, who'd created the television show Babylon 5, had also worked on the likes of World War Z and the Sense8 show that the Wachowskis had put together for Netflix. And so these people were brought together in a room. And the idea was lock their brains together, come up with the story, and at the point it was ready to go, this would fast track the whole process. The idea was break the story for the person who'd come in at the end and direct and potentially write the film. After all the writers have put in their ideas and just basically gone backwards and forwards with them, Terry Rossio penned an extensive treatment version of the story, and that was enough to make Legendary say, yes, we're going to give this the green light. Godzilla vs Kong is happening. So we'll go back in time a little bit. Let's go back to 2017. Because Adam Wingard at that point was a director best known for primarily modestly costed successes such as You're Next and The Guest, a terrific pair of films. Now, he jumped to higher profile fare with 2006 Blair Witch, and he'd made 2017's Death Note that had brought him into the world of visual effects with some aplomb for the first time. And in May 2017, he was offered and accepted the job of directing Godzilla vs Kong. Now, this was not his first brush with King Kong, at least, because he'd first come onto the radar of that character and people trying to make film of him in 2013. And Wingard would reveal to Slash Film in an interview that he'd been earmarked by Peter Jackson, the director of the earlier King Kong film, as someone potentially to direct his own planned King Kong 2. Now, what had drawn Jackson to Adam Wingard was the film You're Next, which again, a really terrific and tight film. I do recommend seeking it out. Simon Barrett had penned that one, and the idea was that Barrett and Wingard would come across, they would get the job of King Kong 2, but in the end, that project didn't really have legs, and it petered out in favour of the Monsterverse that we're talking about now. But crucially, the meetings that were taking place about the new King Kong film back in 2013 were with someone called Mary Parent, who was working with Peter Jackson at that stage. But at the point we come to the story again in 2017, well, Mary Parent was one of the people running Legendary, and so was more than familiar with Adam Wingard, had extensive conversations with him about King Kong before, knew of his love of these films and of monster movies. And so Wingard admitted to Slash Film he didn't have to do a traditional pitch to get the film, that the previous meeting between him and Parent had done a lot of fast tracking of the process, and so he was soon the key candidate for the director's chair of the film. And Wingard accepted. He took the treatment and went through it. That Terry Rossio would then work on a screenplay. Eventually it was Eric Pearson and Max Borenstein who would write the production screenplay of the film. And also putting input into it were Zach Shields and Michael Dougherty, because they had been putting together Godzilla King of the Monsters. And it was crucial to Legendary that all this knitted together in some way. The point was that there was a broader bit of world building for the franchise going on, but also a screenplay, a director, everything finally coming together. And also the financing was in place for a budget that was going to be between $150 to $200 million. This was not going to be cheap, but also there was it was a fairly good bet that this would play well all around the world, assuming no acts of God were incoming. So casting-wise, in June 2018, it was Millie Bobby Brown and Carl Chandler who were confirmed to be appearing in the film, with the rest of the cast fleshing out over the autumn. Brian Tyree Henry, Demian Bashir, Alexander Skarsgård, Elsa Gonzalez and Rebecca Hall, they all signed up in October 2018. Sean Connery, Lance Reddick and Jessica Henwick were also announced in November 2018, although Henwick in the end would be chopped out of the film. I'll come back to that a little bit later. Now, also, I'm jumping backwards and forwards in time, but just shortly after the confirmation of his appointment to direct the film, Wingard addressed the issue with big mashup movies, because it was known that this was going to be Godzilla vs Kong, and we'd sat through Batman vs Superman, we'd sat through Freddy vs Jason, and generally the feeling was if you've got a mashup movie with two high value Hollywood or even global cinema properties, it's going to be some degree of a score draw that you get at the end of it. Well, Wingard wasn't having any of that, and he told Entertainment Weekly that he was keen from the off for his film to actually have a winner. Now, what he also revealed at that stage is he'd also visited the set of Godzilla King of the Monsters, telling again the outlet that part of me just wanted to go there and see what a $200 million or whatever it's costing movie looked like. And he said, I was kind of relieved to see that at a certain point, movies can only get so big. He said, that's what I got from it. It was really educational just from that perspective. And he was also able to talk to Michael Dougherty, who was in the midst of directing a $200 million movie and found a human being at the heart of it. Quite a stressed one, presumably, but that notwithstanding, the pair got on, they got chatting, and Wingard could see his way into this. Now, as part of his preparation for Wingard and his team ahead of making the film, well, that involved watching all 30 Godzilla movies to that point, as well as all 7 King Kong films. Lots of touch points taken from those, as well as Wingard confirmed to Collider, Steven Spielberg's War of the Worlds, that was looked at. Alien Resurrection, interestingly, for its underwater sequences, that was given an extra gorp. And Wingard also confirmed that he was looking to build terrain into the picture and incorporate how each creature would use the terrain and the world that was being built. He was also conscious going into this. It was the first PG-13 movie he'd ever done. Everything else had been R-rated, had not been skewed towards anywhere close to a family audience. And so he was conscious that he had to hit that, but also he wanted to see where the boundaries of it were as well. Now, according to the website Omega Underground, the original start date was due to be October the 1st, 2018. That was when the movie was expected to kick off shooting in Atlanta, in Georgia, in the US. But in fact, it got pushed back for undisclosed reasons. It was November the 12th, 2018 that things got underway. And for a film that's very heavy on visual effects, I don't think that's a massive surprise. It took quite a long physical production for this. The shoot actually went on for the best part of 6 months, and we don't find that a lot with big blockbuster movies. Now, Wingard went into it knowing that there was going to be a lot of CG, so he wanted to avoid using sets wherever possible. He wanted to bring as much realism in as he could. He knew that his two main characters, these two main creatures, were going to be generated by computer, so everything else had to do a bit of extra heavy lifting in there as well. And he didn't want to shortchange audiences. He did want in-camera stuff as much as he could. And it was a shoot that wrapped up in April 2019. Worryingly for Legendary, it wrapped up a month before Godzilla King of the Monsters came out, and a month before basically Godzilla King of the Monsters spluttered a little bit at the box office, because even as Wingard went into post-production on Godzilla vs Kong, the poor reviews and the underwhelming box office for the Godzilla title was spooking Warner Brothers a little, to the point where it instantly started talking about delaying the film from its then planned March 2020 release date to give Wingard and his team a bit more space to get the movie right. That they just wanted to make sure the schedule afforded the space to really just tune the movie and not make the same mistake twice. Now, there were cutbacks as a result. There were changes in post-production, and that included Jessica Henwick's role just being taken out. And this in turn affected Elsa Gonzalez as well, that she gave an interview where she talked about how her role got completely changed in the film. This was to Deadline. And she said a lot of the story got cut out and the story was completely changed. So it was a bummer, she said, because my character had a whole different storyline that went in different routes. For Jessica Henwick, she noted that getting cut out of the movie really affected all of the other characters, but it wasn't anything to do with Jessica's character. It was just that the storyline changed because the movie is called Godzilla Vs Kong, and it obviously has to service them. And that's where a lot of the post-production work was going to, really refocusing the film that way. Now, Wingard was determined to bring in his cut under 2-hour running time, which he duly did as well. He didn't want one of those blockbuster films that would just go on for all time. The delay that Warner Brothers ultimately announced moved the film from March of 2020 to November of 2020. And that was 7-8 months of extra time for VFX work. It didn't stop Wingard having to work hard on getting his cut right. At one stage, it was said that he had a 5-hour running cut of the film, but he wasn't looking to do a director's cut. He wanted the final running time to hit his target. It comes in at 113 minutes, actually, Godzilla vs. Kong. And it's not a case of hitting you with lots of deleted scenes and stuff either. This was the film that he wanted to make in roughly the shape he wanted to make as well. And so promotion could slowly get underway, and it looked like all plans were going fine. And then the pandemic happened. Now, I suspect you're aware of this pandemic, but this impacted an awful lot of movies, of which Godzilla vs. Kong was one of them. I mean, the promotion had already started in May of 2019 for the film as well. And as early as February 2020, there was all sorts of tie-ins that were being announced and that were being pushed out. But deep in the corridors of Warner Brothers, decisions were being taken that would affect the release of Godzilla vs. Kong, as well as every movie that Warner Brothers had planned for now 2021. Because with cinemas being closed, it was clear Godzilla vs. Kong could not release in 2020. And so Warner Brothers made the big tactical decision that it would debut all of its 2021 release slate in cinemas and on its HBO Max streaming service in the US on the same day. Now, this decision went down in many quarters like a metaphorical fart in a very small car. It's said to be the reason that Christopher Nolan ended his 20-year relationship with Warner Brothers and why his next film, Oppenheimer, has been set up at Universal instead. Denis Villeneuve was reportedly not happy at all that his Dune movie was now going to be available on streaming a day after it was released on the big screen. And it was felt that Warner Brothers was just selling cinemas short. Still, it inked a release date. March the 21st, 2021 was when Godzilla vs. Kong was finally going to be released after pandemic delays. And it was one of the first big blockbusters of 2021, at least, to make it to the big screen in some degree of tact. And it turned out it was a real beacon of hope in the end for the cinema industry. So, I mean, let's just look at the reception of it first. That the reviews for the film were, I mean, they were all right. I mean, the title gives you it tells you exactly what you're going to get, and you get it. Godzilla vs. Kong is a very loud, very upfront film, which does include Godzilla and Kong having a massive scrap with some human beings in the midst of it. Entertaining, certainly, and that's why, I mean, the reviews were certainly kinder than they were for the previous Godzilla movie, and just fun. I think that was a fair summation of it. Surprisingly, though, even though it was appearing on HBO Max on the same day it was in cinemas, Godzilla vs. Kong ended up with quite an impressive opening weekend. In fact, that is an understatement and a half, because given where cinema was at that point in the spring of 2021, the full opening weekend in the US of April the 2nd to the 4th was an incredible result, a $31 million opening at a point where no other film in the top 10 grossed more than $3.5 million. And in fact, if you go back a week before Godzilla vs. Kong opened up, the top film was Nobody, which had opened in first place. And Nobody is a really fun action film, but it opened with $6.8 million. The Disney film Raya and the Last Dragon, I mean, it'd taken a month to get to $30 million. Chaos Walking had been around for ages on the Lionsgate slate, and that was now 4 weeks in with $11 million in the tank. And the weeks leading up to the release of Godzilla vs Kong was something of a graveyard of big and small films that were just struggling to get people back out of their homes and into a cinema. Now, as much as Godzilla vs Kong was a massive hit on HBO Max for Warner Brothers as well, it was the fact that it delivered in cinemas that was crucial. And even its second weekend of 13.8 million saw a drop of only 56% of its audience. I mean, hefty, but nowhere near as hefty as you might expect. And that was with films such as Nobody's Still Around and Voyager's opening, Tom and Jerry, The Courier, The Croods, A New Age, just a bunch of films that weren't really heavily competing on that scale. And so Godzilla vs Kong could sit at the top of the chart right until Mortal Kombat toddled along at the end of April with 23 million. But crucially for Hollywood, this was a film that crossed $100 million at the domestic box office, 100.9 million in the US, and then another 369 million outside of the US. Here was a film that had brought in nearly $500 million of worldwide takings, in spite of being available on streaming, in spite of being widely pirated as well. I mean, let's say it. The film had really offered fresh hope that people would come back out for blockbuster movies, that they still, even if they could watch a film at home, if you gave them the right movie, they would turn up in cinemas. Now, of course, the aftermath of it was really quite bumpy. There were many blockbusters that failed. There were certainly many films and dramas aiming at older audiences that didn't get people out of their homes and didn't get bums on seats. But Godzilla vs Kong, that was one that did, to the point where in March of 2022, Godzilla vs Kong 2 was announced, and again Adam Wingard was coming back, and he this time brought in his old mate from The Guest, Dan Stevens. Now, at the point of this being recorded, Godzilla vs Kong 2 is about 11 months away from release. But still, no matter how that film turns out, the existence of just this monster mashup at a time when Hollywood needed a big movie to go out onto screens and get people to pay to see it, well, the fact that it did that, and the fact that it did that when nobody else was really doing it on anything like that scale, well, it's earned its place in modern blockbuster history. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. If I've not bored you completely, you can find more from me on Twitter at Simon Brew. You can find more on the entire Film Stories project at Film Stories. We're on Facebook at facebook.com/Film Stories Online. We're at YouTube at youtube.com/Film Stories. Our online shop is store.filmstories.co.uk with over 50 issues of assorted magazines that we've produced available to purchase there. And our website is filmstories.co.uk. That's where you'll find every day, every weekday at least, an update of news, movie news, reviews, features, things like that really, and mischief that we're up to. The most important thing, as always, is that you all take care and you all look after yourselves. I will be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, I'm off to watch a bunch of movies. You all take care. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.